In the earlier days of Creepypasta, before Creepcast was a twinkle in Meat Canyon's eyes, and Wendigoon was still in diapers, barely even reading Cormac McCarthy, there were still Creepypasta podcasts. However, what anyone will tell you after having done just a podcast and nothing else, that's no way to gain a following. I know this from experience. Hey, it's Zach Glenn, aka Glenn the Golden, here with another video about horror fiction. This time I'm firing up the time machine to give you all a history lesson on specifically the 2013 era of the creepypasta. This was before No Sleep was a super big deal. This was before the SCP Wiki had grown into a collective of short fiction authors. At the time, there was just the creepypasta, and one of the best authors of the creepypasta was Slimebeast. In the early days of creepypasta, if you were one of the people that were hopeful that creepypasta would coalesce into some kind of actual literary fiction movement online, you were likely one of the several hundred people that were listening to a podcast called Undercooked Analysis, hosted on a channel called Midnight Marinara by a guy called David King. I know I was one of the people that was watching this. Much of what makes Creepcast a good podcast was originally being done on Midnight Marinara, especially reaching out to and treating authors cordially, which is something that the broader creepypasta community was notorious for not doing. I'm going to get into it a lot more in depth later, but one of the reasons that I think that Slimebeast is not as fondly remembered as other creepypasta authors is that he clashed with people that were trying to monetize his stories and not cut him in on it. And I ultimately view him as creepypasta's Harlan Ellison. I think that he fought vociferously to defend his intellectual copyright, and ultimately, because there were people that were trying to exploit the nature of the popularity of creepypasta, I think that he is going to be remembered as someone who was in the right. Slimebeast and I actually have a history. I'd like to apologize to the guy because I think I was actually wrong about something, which I will emphasize is a thing that almost never happens. When I was younger, I told him that I did not think that right-wing artists could produce art, which is something that I definitely disagree with now, although I do think ultimately the point that I was spiritually trying to make is true, which is that people that are obsessed with the idea of countering wokeness are never going to make real art. But if you're watching this Slimebeast, my bad. I was definitely way too broad. Ultimately, I think it would be a tragedy for Slimebeast to be cut out of the creation of the creepypasta scene that sprung from that scene that began in 2013, or to be remembered only for Abandoned by Disney and Room Zero. Now, do I feel a little guilty about covering Room Zero and Abandoned by Disney on the channel instead of one of his other stories? Yeah, a little. But unlike a lot of other people who have applied a critical eye to Slimebeast's writing, I'm intending to actually draw reference to some of his other short stories and hopefully give an idea of how he's grown as an author over time. I think most noticeably, there's a really big improvement in his writing from 2013 to the writing that you will see in the later section of this video that happens in 2014. He improves a lot over the course of a year, and I really want to emphasize how much he improves because I think by focusing just on Abandoned by Disney, you really miss out on how much he improves over time as a writer, and it's really cool to watch. So without further ado, I am going to get into Abandoned by Disney by Slimebeast, but first, one last thing. I have a lot of videos planned for this channel, including a bunch over the summer as a teacher, so I would really appreciate if you all give me a subscribe, ring the little bell, give me a comment, anything to help me out in the algorithm. I'm really trying to transfer my following over from Twitter and Spotify over to here, so every little bit helps. Thanks, folks, and enjoy the show. Abandoned by Disney by Christopher Howard Wolfe, aka Slimebeast. Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yes, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. So right away, something that I like about this story, and I think it really jives with Slimebeast's ethos regarding creepypasta. He thinks that creepypasta, at least if I'm remembering correctly, because I've listened to a lot of interviews from him in the past, and like I said, I've listened to Midnight Marinara, so I've seen him talking about art. He believes that creepypasta should sound like someone recounting an urban legend to you. In Midnight Marinara, they talked about something called ashcan horror, which was the idea of a bunch of hobos gathered around a burning trash can and exchanging scary stories, which I think is a pretty accurate idea of how creepypasta is supposed to work. It plays with that idea of verisimilitude, the idea that the story has to be real, and also it plays into some of the later ideas that we see with more successful creepypasta-esque amateur horror collectives like No Sleep. No Sleep had that verisimilitude because you had to be someone that survived to tell the story on No Sleep. And so that creates that same element of this is an urban legend that I'm being told. And I think a lot of it started here with Slimebeast. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate. And there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and it obviously wasn't because foreigners are lazy. Both are convenient excuses. No, I sincerely doubt these reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's Palace. Near the beachside city of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace in the late 1990s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. So, there's a few things that I want to point out here. First is that Slimebeast in the story shows that he's a master of doing a cold open. We start in the middle of the action, you draw the reader in. I think this is perfect for short horror fiction in general, and even more important on internet fiction because you're competing with a bunch of other stuff for people's attention. Now, I think that he struggles a little bit when building connecting threads, but I don't think you're going to see that very much in Abandoned by Disney because it's a little bit on the shorter side at only around 1,500 words. And I do think he improves a little bit on that with each iteration of this story, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Lastly, I want to talk about the importance of research in writing here instead of the places where everybody else talks about it. Because I think it's easy to brush aside some of the criticism of researching before you start your writing, when it mostly seems like it's Disney adults that are mad at you about confusing the term cast member for mascot later on, which does happen. And in my opinion, as someone that really doesn't give a shit about Disney, I don't think it's a very big deal. But there are some things that make the story seem less realistic. And to me, it's not the mascot versus cast member distinction. It's the thing about Emerald Isle in North Carolina. Emerald Isle has, since the 90s, and since for a long time, already been incredibly overdeveloped. The idea that there would be space to put a resort there for Disney, in my opinion, it's pretty unrealistic. It's an island. It's a barrier island at that. It's not very big. There is, however, inland, a larger city called Morehead City where I could see the park being. And because there wasn't any research done prior to telling the story, or not enough research done, I suppose, those details get overlooked and break the realism, which is something that I know that he's going for as an author. And while I think it's easy to say, okay, maybe this is coming from an alternate reality version of Disney where they call the people working there something else, I think that's easy to brush aside. I think the idea that there's space to put a theme park on Emerald Island, it's a little less so. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you might remember the story The Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you'd know it as the Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals, and simultaneously threatened/pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land for the project, and there was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. One thing that works really well here right away is the idea of Disney as a villain. I think Disney as a villain does a lot of interesting things thematically. Disney at times has been very close with the American government. So if you want to run a story about corruption, you have a lot of options there. And it's even in one of the later stories titles, Corruptus. There's a lot of things that you can get into about class. Unfortunately, the series doesn't really do it very much. But there would be a lot thematically that you could get to about class going around Disney, because Disney has been a huge corporation since its inception at this point. Then there was the concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Company actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. When they showed the concept art, this gigantic Indian palace, surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear, will suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealthy area, but also a somewhat xenophobic area in the southern USA. It was part of a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. I want to get into more of what works here, because I think one thing that is really important in this story, and I know I mentioned it as a reason that I liked another story on this channel, that would be Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. Haunted places need to have a reason to be haunted. And by giving this place a history that involves displacing the locals, I think this place has a reason to be haunted. I think what doesn't work is the idea that the locals wouldn't want any of this here because they're racist. Yeah, a lot of people around the South are racist, but xenophobic communities don't tend to hate the works of Rudyard Kipling. The idea that these colonialist narratives are hated by the locals because they're racist, no, they only have this conception of other people. That is part of why they're racist. So I don't think that works as well as he intends it to. I think honestly, just displacing the people would have been enough to have a reason for them to be so upset. I also think this is the kind of paternalism that we saw in The Summer People. Slimebeast is assuming that this is what people in the South are like because they're known to be politically backwards, but conservatism, especially in America, likes to have these kinds of paternalistic attitudes about other races. So I don't think they'd be super opposed to the loincloths and everything like that. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over its knee as well. The houses were razed, the land was cleared, and there wasn't a damned thing anyone could do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and the local venues came into play, and their opinions turned on a dime. So anyway, Treasure Island, the Bahamas. Disney sunk those millions in and then split. The same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Then it all just stopped. Disney shut it down and nobody knew what the hell to think. But they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I lived maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle. So really, I only heard the rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I read the article from someone who'd explored the Treasure Island resort and posted a whole blog about all the crazy shit he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there felt just as angry about Treasure Island as folks here did about Mowgli's Palace. Plus, there were rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed, including sharks. Another aspect of the story that I really like is that the area has already grown into a bit of a haunted house for the locals. There are stories spreading that can't be verified, including the idea of sharks being in fresh water, which usually doesn't mix. And so there's already kind of this fictitious element, or even this fantastical element of could something supernatural be happening? And that's why there's these animals where they shouldn't be. And there's actually some stuff that hints towards that later. So, again, good use of foreshadowing from an amateur author, in my opinion. Who would want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? What I'm getting at is that this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking, even though many years had passed since its closing. I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mowgli's Palace, take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there was anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time in getting there, because honestly it took me another year after I found that Treasure Island article to get around to going up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place. That had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that was to be expected since they had all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out there lauding their embarrassment, you know. Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably not that nobody spoke of the resort, but rather their words were made inaccessible. Disney comes across here as an all-powerful entity or an all-powerful villain. But some people are going to say that's unrealistic. They don't like the way that works. I actually disagree. I think it works really well. Disney's clearly close with the American government within this story because they built a bomb shelter during the Cold War. And they had those connections in real life too, to the point that there are even rumors about Disney projects involving conspiracies that don't exist, like Project Monarch's mind control experiments that involved showing kids Disney at a young age. Not real, but it takes advantage of Disney's close relationship with the federal government to create those kinds of urban legends. And those are real urban legends. So I think Slimebeast is doing something really good here, and it doesn't break it does not break the verisimilitude of the story at all. It seems completely realistic in my opinion. So in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was an old as hell map I'd received back in the mail in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent out to people who had recently been to Disney World, and I guess, since I'd been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't initially intend to hang on to it. I just got shoved in with my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remembered it months into my research, and even then, it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved to the breach in recent years, or old residents who had sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I managed to say, "Where would I find Mowgli's door slam shut noise?" These last few graphs, detailing the process of how our main character gets to the actual Mowgli's Palace resort, including tracking it down, I think it veers a little bit into prolixness in writing. It's a little bit of a drudge. I'm not sure that we necessarily need all those details because they don't ultimately inform the story or setting all that much. I mention later on in the script, and I'm going to get into it a little bit here off the cuff, but I think that Slimebeast would have been better served making a larger amount of the setting the internet, like cyberspace or digital space. He does this in a couple stories. Funny Mouth, I think, is one of his best stories that does this. And I do talk about it later a few times because it shows his growth as a writer from this story. But I think cyberspace would have been a better place to investigate, and also plays with the nature of creepypastas a little bit better. I do think this is a lesson that a lot of people have internalized since then, and yet I don't have a lot of great fiction that really emphasizes digital space that much as part of the setting. And I think we're becoming a more digital society. I think that you can do it without sacrificing the artisticness of the plot or the story. There's always people that are like, oh, don't put cell phones in horror because if you put cell phones in horror, the characters have an answer to everything and there's no tension in the plot. And yet, I don't think that's true. I think a great counterexample to this is Eddington. It's not the best movie in the world, but I thought it was good, especially compared to a lot of its contenders of recent movies that have come out. And it features cell phones very heavily and is a period piece around COVID. And yet, it is very scary to go up against the unstoppable force of the government and the big corporations within Eddington, which is another aspect that Slimebeast hits really early on here in 2013 when talking about Disney. Again, I think he's a better author than he's remembered for, folks. The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth. Tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. Tremendous monolithic wooden gates whose supports to either side looked like they must have been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap, with hand-painted letters scrawled in black. Abandoned by Disney. Clearly the handiwork of some past local or an employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open to walk through but not drive, so I grabbed my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort. I set off on foot. This line and a line where the narrator says that he approached the main building are the actual only lines in this initial description of the park that tell the audience the narrator is moving, which is another thing that I think that Slimebeast does really well. A lesser author would try to narrate every single step that our character takes through the park. And yet, here, instead, we just get descriptions of what he's seeing, which is a much better way of putting us both in the perspective of the narrating character and also not bore us with a bunch of details that we don't need to hear about, like him trudging through the park. The inner grounds of the palace were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood untended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood in their own stinking bug-riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxious tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken, rotting wood, and various charred bits of unidentifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now simply a pile of assorted debris chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, which stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave towards no one, staring into an empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird shit covered whole swaths of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti, where the original paint hadn't peeled and chipped away. The front doors were just as open. They had been taken off their hinges and were stolen. Above the front doors, or the gaping maw where they had been, someone had once again painted "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you all the awesome stuff I saw inside the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums. But no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I actually think people had stolen the molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, giant fake trees, they were all resting amid this empty echo chamber that amplified every step, like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. One of the aspects of Abandoned by Disney, in comparison to most creepypastas, in my opinion, is how grounded it is in its description of things. Of course, there's going to be nothing left in the resort, and so not only does Slimebeast think of that, but he also gives us a very accurate description of what an empty room sounds like when all you're left with is no furniture and an echo. And it gives off a very eerie vibe. I checked the floor plan and headed to all the locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was as you'd imagine, an industrial food prep area with all the appliances in space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat, and as I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their movements were so slow and small that it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching it in my fist, then carefully letting go, but within seconds, it started to swing once more. There's a couple things that are going on here that I really like. This is the first sign that there's something supernatural going on inside of the resort, which I think is necessary to foreshadow because we're definitely going to be on the supernatural side by the end of this. But this also leans into ambiguity. We don't know why the chains are swinging, but we also get a defiance of the cliche. It's not that he bumped the chains, it's not that somebody else has been in here ahead of him and bumped the chains. The chains just move. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the rest of this place. Just like the Treasure Island Resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain? It's a very nice porcelain toilet. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the rest of the place, just like the Treasure Island Resort. Someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was about a half inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't stay there very long. What's odd is that the toilets and the sinks, and the bidets in the ladies' room, yes, I went there, all dripped, leaked, or just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut the water off long, long ago. I think there's an interesting juxtaposition here between home invasion stories and haunted house stories. In home invasion stories, or stories that work with a home invasion vibe, like the Summer People, that you don't actually know if it's a home invasion story or not, utilities mysteriously shut off, and that's part of the source of the horror. When you're looking at these abandoned haunted house stories, oftentimes they'll have the utilities mysteriously working, and that's part of the horror. And I think that's a really fun detail because it shows that even though they're both horror stories, it's not necessarily the action, it's about what your expectation is and that expectation being defied. And I think that's really one of the key elements of writing horror. So I think that's just a cool thing to point out. There were plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to look through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room, as I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out. Through it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing in the silence, or just another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks on the mind. This is what it sounded like. I didn't believe it. Voice 2, short unknown reply. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Your father told you. Unknown reply, or possibly just weeping. Alright, I like this detail a lot. I think that a lot of families can be downright abusive when it comes to how they interact with their children on family vacations. And when we go back to the idea of a haunted house needing a reason to be haunted, the abuse of family, I think, would be a good reason for that. I think this gets alluded to the most as far as possible themes throughout the story, but there's not enough emphasis for me to say that this is a definitive theme. And I hate that because I think that it is the most interesting thread in the story that shows up often enough to call it a potential theme for Slimebeast's Abandoned by Disney work. I know that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Why I thought there might have been something running in that room, or worse, some vagrants who would hold up there and probably would have knifed me. At the front doors of the palace again, I noticed I hadn't found anything of note and had wasted the trip up. As I looked at the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I had apparently missed. Something that would give me at least one thing to show for all my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on a pedestal right in the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell onto the object in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer to get the detail of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned, and slithered off the pedestal, across the grass, and into the trees. All 80 feet of it. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals on the ground. Right there on my floor plan map was the reptile house. I should have known. I'd read about the sharks at Treasure Isle, and I should have known they'd done this. Okay, I already talked about how sharks and freshwater don't often get along. They can get into freshwater, but they don't often survive there for long periods of time. And it's got to have been at least 23 years, roughly, since Mowgli's palace opened. And yet, there's still sharks in the waters, apparently. Likewise, there's this 80-foot python. In nature, pythons grow up to like 30 or 40 feet. I looked up for the video. So the presence of this park and the haunting that it is doing to this area is affecting the animals nearby. They're growing to sizes that they shouldn't be. They're surviving and breeding in conditions that they shouldn't be able to be. And it does show some care of thought that goes into Abandoned by Disney that I don't think that you see in a lot of stories. Now, unfortunately, we're going to have about one or two good more scenes in this story, and then it's going to undermine a lot of the goodwill that it's earned with me so far with the final scare. Which is why it's still only a creepypasta and not, in my opinion, venerable short horror fiction on its own. But I think it is one of the better examples from this era of amateur horror fiction writing. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back to Earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back toward the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances and backed my way into the building. It took a few deep breaths and slaps to my own face to get myself right in the head again after that. I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet, or haul myself onto a desk of questionable reliability. I'd seen some stairs near the palace's lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from the front of the building to be relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the Abandoned by Disney motto I've become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep myself at least somewhat clean. The stair led downward, below ground level. Using my camera flash as a sort of improvised flashlight, I could see that the staircase ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, read, "Mascots only, thank you." I am not going to interrupt this story to talk about what other people typically talk about here. I am just going to say, using the flash of the camera really dates this story because every camera has a flashlight function now. They knew that we did this and tech improvised. This perked up my spirits a little bit for two reasons. One, a mascots only area would have definitely had some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. I think in people's rush to talk about the mascots only section here and rub it in their face that they can research better than someone that wrote a story briefly when they were 25-ish. I'm gonna guess. I don't know Slimebeast's age, but I'm guessing. Slimebeast, if you're here in the comments, were you around 24 or 25 when you wrote this? Anyway, I think they're overlooking something interesting here that the story does, because in a haunted house story, the antagonist is kind of the haunted house. The haunted house can serve as its own character, and so it can do things to tempt the characters to go down certain passages, or to lure them, or to act as bait. And so, by having this section that the protagonist discovers here, that kind of leads him into the heart of the haunted house, where the actual spooky stuff can start to happen. Or, spooky stuff has already happened, but where the true climax of the story is going to occur. I think that really cool detail is getting overlooked just to rub it in someone's face that they didn't do their research. And, I can be a harsh critic, and there are certainly some bones that I'm going to pick with this story and Room Zero as well. I feel more comfortable doing it with Room Zero because it's an even stronger story than this one, yet still not quite professional grade. And yet people are overlooking the talent of amateur writers when they are unwilling to assess things as being intentional choices that were made seriously. This was the one place I could actually explore, and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or wantonly steal. I had come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted because, hey, abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually, that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of or hadn't been able to do at the time. And this, again, I think, is a detail that shows that the house could be trying to get our narrator to go into this area. People could have been here before, but we're trying to show our narrator that there's actual juicy stuff to take in here. So we need to get him to come in. And so either the park could be acting on our narrator's will, or, maybe it is all factual that no one's been down there yet. I can't speak for what exactly was on the author's mind, but either way, I think it's a good choice. The mascots only area was a startling and very welcomed one from the rest of the building I'd seen. For once, every second or third fluorescent light overhead was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure were definitely taking their toll. Tables had notes, pads, and pens. There were clocks, even a punch-in clock on the wall, complete with filled-out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with an old static-filled television and long rotted-out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those post-apocalypse movies where everything is left in the state of evacuation. As I walked the maze-like sub-basement of the mascots only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, paper scattered and almost melded with the damp floor, and a large carpet of mold was slowly overtaking the real, rotting crimson floor covering. I do think that here would have been a good place to insert something into the narrative that implies that Mowgli's palace was inside the narrator's head, was influencing him while he was there. I know that this is a theme that Slimebeast likes to play with because of Funny Mouth, so I could definitely see him doing that in his writing. The reason that it would have been good to insert here is that the narrator was startled when the park had access to running water and doesn't seem to show any signs of being upset now that the park has access to electricity, which is something that it also shouldn't have. Generators require fuel, they don't just keep going indefinitely. So I think here would have been a good place to put that and show our narrator starting to have a break from reality. This would also be a good point to add length to the story. At 1,500 words, it's kind of short. I think by taking some of the suggestions here and really honing in on the climax of the story, and also doing a little bit more to establish the digital world as a setting early on, we could add like a 3,000 word story, which is more in line with what you're looking for with short fiction. Though this is a good story. It's better than a lot of the short horror fiction that you see from around the same time period. Everything was just sort of squishy. Anything wood disintegrated into mush when I applied even the least amount of force, and clothing items hanging on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell to moist threads if I tried to unhook them. This detail works really well with the abusive family details from earlier. When you're doing a haunted location, a haunted house story, one of the details that you can choose to include, and that horror authors frequently choose to include, is exaggerated sensory details from the people that left behind that kind of psychic energy that's required for the haunting. And Hellish Humidity, I think, accurately describes a lot of really bad family vacations. So if we had some of those more threads of abuse working through the story, I think that this part of the story would feel even more unnerving. It already, I think, works as a better scare, as the penultimate scare, than the final climax of the story scare. But I think it could work even better with just a few details kind of changed around. One thing that annoyed me was that the light was becoming more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dark, suffocating depths of the place. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words Character Prep 1 stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where costumes were kept, and I definitely wanted a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started to walk away. That was when there was a slight popping sound, and the door creaked open slowly. Between a door where the palace wants the narrator to go opening by itself, the chains in the kitchen moving by themselves, the running water still working, and the electricity still working, I think it's safe to say that Slimebeast wants us to see Mowgli's palace as a living and haunted thing, and not just the photo negative Mickey that is upcoming. And I honestly think the photo negative Mickey is the part of Abandoned by Disney that works the least. Everything else that leads up to it works so well that you could see it in a professionally published haunted house story. And yet the climax of the story is, in my opinion, such a letdown that it is what really makes the story identifiable as amateur fiction. There are some literary techniques that Slime Beast could have done to make this more apparent, and then he could have probably put more faith in the audience and abandoned the photo negative Mickey concept altogether, since it is kind of the part of the story that works the least well. The first, and this is what you kind of see in your haunted house stories like Amityville, is we could have used some personification of the details of the park. So anything that made parts of the park look human. We could have described certain aspects of the park as looking like a face or like eyes. That's really commonly done and is really goes back to Amityville. The other thing that could have been done, and I don't think that it would have been done at the time, but I do think it's worth emphasizing now because I feel like we do have a more robust amateur writing scene now than we did back in 2013. He could have done perspective shifts. So we could have shifted between the perspective of the narrator and the perspective of the entity of Mowgli's palace, this house that tries to draw in people and wants to claim new victims for the Disney Corporation. I think that could have been really cool. It's not something you would have seen in 2013 though. So you like, if anybody that's watching this faults Slime Beast for not doing that, you're in the wrong. It wasn't gonna happen. Not for an amateur writer at that point in time. Nah. Inside the room was completely dark. Pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my sense of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I had passed. It took me a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed that like the light was going to just keep getting brighter until all the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought it would reach that critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly as I had pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on hangers toward the back. What I found odd, and what I wanted to photograph right away, was a Mickey Mouse costume at the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on its back in the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse. Black where he should have been white, and white where he should have been black. His normally red overalls were light blue. Does this Mickey Mouse work as a villain in this horror story? No, not really. In my opinion, we've already seen more horrifying things leading up to the reveal of this costume, including a room that is so humid that everything that you touch in it just kind of sloughs off into your hand like moldy cake. You're not going to get anything much grosser than that, even though the story does try. And in my opinion, you're really not going to get anything scarier than that level of rot kind of coming for something that was supposed to bring people joy, like this theme park. If we go back to a story that I think works really well, Tell Me I'm Worthless, and is a haunted house story, does that story have an explosive ending as well, with violence and kind of gross out elements? Yeah, but it really kind of foreshadows that they're going to be coming the entire time. And we don't get that in this story. All we really get foreshadowed is the fact that this resort is haunted, and you don't really need the Mickey Mouse costume for the haunting part to be true. So I don't think it works super well. I think it is what ultimately denotes this story as coming off as amateurish, because everything leading up to it is really strong. And it's a shame because, like, I'm not even sure if Slimebeast really wanted to do this, if this was something he felt pushed to include as an author, because of its artistic merits. And the reason that I say that is, at the time, almost everybody in the creepypasta audience really expected that a story was going to lead into some kind of mascot or creature like Slenderman, Jeff the Killer, Tiki Toby. There are more that I'm definitely forgetting, but those are the ones that I remember from that era. And Photo Negative Mickey was definitely included in those kinds of fan art collages that people were making. So it definitely met with its intended audience, but I think it meets with its intended audience at the cost of the artistic merits of the story itself. And that sucks, because Slimebeast is actually a talented author, but the people in that era didn't really want talent. And in some ways, that's still true today. If you look at that big writing contest, Commonwealth Literary Award, even a lot of critics really like slop. That's why they couldn't tell or didn't care that an AI short story was winning an award. So, food for thought. Does it work? No. Is it necessarily Slimebeast's fault? Also, no. I think audiences do deserve some blame for the choices that artists make, because art is somewhat a commercial enterprise. But every time that it is at a commercial enterprise, it is at the cost of the artistic merits of that art. Anyway, back to the story. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the walls, upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces, some with plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot. Just one of the bedraggled character heads on the slick, grimy floor. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud, clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you'd expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know? I had to. For any number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you don't think it through. I need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind right from the start that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. There is or was, I don't know if you see it as much anymore. There was a quirk of amateur writing that you see in this story a lot, which is that when a word intends to be emphasized, it's not italicized, it's uppercase. You all can't see this because you don't have the manuscript in front of you, but it is there. I don't think it really hurts stories at all when they do this, but I wanted to point it out. I think it's fun, and I think it shows the era that this story came from, in addition to some of the other smaller details, like him having to take pictures on his cell phone to get the flash to work instead of just having a flashlight function. There are things that, if you're reading this, really rooted it in 2013 when it came out. That's when Mickey, that photo-negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up and then climbing to its feet, the Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there at the center of the room, its fake face just staring directly at me as I mumbled no over and over and over. With shaking hands, a violently thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to tilt the camera and aim at the opposite creature now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera's screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died, went blank and quiet and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. "Hey," it said in a wait. "Hey," it said in a perverted but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. "Want to see my head pop off?" I mean, it is a perfect Mickey Mouse impression. It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsy, glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits into its neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky, yellow blood. I always thought that the blood itself was a pretty good description that's kind of undermined by what it's coming from. The photo-negative Mickey Mouse that just spoke to us in a ha-ha voice is not really a scary thing to have bleeding yellow spooky blood. Like I said, I think that, and especially the voice, it all serves to undermine the whole story and everything that I think that the author works to until that point. Sucks. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and flesh, only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. Abandoned by God. I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. After I ran from that place, fled for my sanity if not my very life, I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want anything like that getting out. So that was Abandoned by Disney by Slimebeast, aka Christopher Howard Wolf. There is one more detail that I would like to talk about before I get into the short story overall. And that is at the very end, the detail Abandoned by God. I think clashes with some of the other parts of the story tonally. We're really mostly focused on the evils of the Disney Corporation here. So Abandoned by God, sure, I guess, but it just kind of seems like it's melodrama included for melodrama's sake. You have to understand, I will cover it at some point, but the Russian sleep experiment was a big deal in creepypasta circles at the time. It got a lot of play, despite, in my opinion, being probably one of the worst stories that people considered well constructed. So There's a reason that it's in here, and it really mostly has to do again with audience expectations, which is why I do think we need to talk about how the audience can make art worse overall. And I think they really definitely contributed to it in the early days of creepypasta construction. So at the end of the first section of the series, we have a story that I would consider to be a great example of the upper end of like hobbyist, amateur writers just starting out. I think Abandoned by Disney is a great example of the level of craftsmanship that somebody can have as an author before they really decide to buckle down and dedicate themselves to the craft in its entirety. And that said, I think there are places in the text that are somewhat slow, such as the lead up to getting into the park itself, that could be strengthened by creating a different setting that could be used later on. We know from the advantage of hindsight that he goes on to continue the story and that the internet ends up being a helpful part of the narrator's information gathering during Room Zero. If that had been a present detail from the start of the story, I think it could have really strengthened the setting. And I think it would have given us less time spent in Emerald Isle rooting around. It's only 4 paragraphs, it's not very long, but it's just long enough that I think something else that would have contributed to the setting later in the sequels would have been a little bit more helpful to focus on. When I first started to cover this, I had planned to cover only the original Abandoned by Disney story in this video. But as I looked into it and began to recall some of the specific details from Slimebeast's career, and also the details with how this story played out in terms of intellectual property and everything else, I think it's important to at least cover Room Zero and then talk about some of the details of how intellectual property was handled in the early days of creepypasta. For example, my suggestion that an author that wanted to make Abandoned by Disney a stronger story would expand some of the investigatory process online. Slimebeast does that in the follow-up stories, so I want to focus on how he grew as an author, and I think it's important to have both stories back to back in order to do that. I think the additional characters that he throws in and the internet as a setting is done better than some of the more popular creepypasta attempts at something similar like smile.jpg, especially if you look at something like Funny Mouth. However, Slimebeast does make an attempt to introduce characters which provide leads to our story in the next section, which doesn't really do much to enhance the story because the characters are both flat and killed off in order to advance the stakes for the narrator. It's apparent to me that Slimebeast wasn't sure how much attention he would garner for these stories. I think that he was definitely hoping to get more than he did on some of his stories that didn't play into some of these tropes that creepypasta fans were expecting in their stories. While the scope of the project can change and change positively if it's for certain artistic merits, like you didn't feel like the themes that you wanted to explore in the Abandoned by Disney story were accurately explored, there are certain things in some of the stories, especially Corruptus, and I'll talk about it because I'm not going to read it, I'm mostly going to summarize it, that point toward the idea that he was influenced by some of the negative reception or negative experiences that he had online. And I think that a lot of people need to come to terms with the fact that, hey, look, you're not Kendrick Lamar, and people are not going to be tuning in just to see you hate on the people that have personally wronged you. I think that's a lesson that a lot of people on social media could stand to internalize, but I think it's especially true of anybody that wants to incorporate that in their art. You really need to make sure that you have good artistic reasons for trying to burn those who disagree with you or burn those who have wronged you in your art. I think it usually comes across as petty, and people don't come across as Dante Alighieri or Kendrick Lamar. Ultimately, I don't really want to cover Corruptus because too much of the focus, in my opinion, is on how the creepypasta community interacted with Abandoned by Disney and how they treated Slimebeast. And while those things, in my opinion, were really wrong, I think just covering them in the context of the video covers more than enough. And by covering the two best parts of this project, I can really focus on his merits as an artist, which is really what I would like to do with these kinds of review videos. If I'm going to even be giving this kind of biographical approach, which is not going to be possible with every artist, I've just been online for a very long time, so I've seen a lot of these things play out firsthand with this story in particular. I want to really focus on what makes these stories work artistically and what makes these stories not work artistically. Because I think a lot of these writers could be novelists if they really worked on their craft. The same way that a lot of YouTubers are becoming directors, I think a lot of these people could have had the chops to really be published. So now another story for you all. I'm regaling you twice this time. This is Room Zero by Slimebeast. It shows quite a bit of growth, in my opinion, between his first story and this story. And yet there are still threads that we can pick at that could show where he could show even more improvement as a writer. And don't think I'm piling on because I'm better. I might be better than this now, but this is a phase that we've all gone through as writers. I'm lucky enough that I didn't really publish a lot of my stuff online. I kept it in notebook paper at the edge of my dresser bed. And when I felt like I had grown a lot as a writer to the point where that was now cringe, I threw it all away. And now I would love to be able to read some of that to show you that everybody goes through this kind of embarrassing phrase of clunky dialogue and all this good stuff. I don't even have it anymore because I found it so embarrassing. So to put this story up and leave it up for everybody to be able to see and anyone to take a jab at, like, you really have to treat the early people in the creepypasta community, especially those that didn't go on to do fucked up shit, unlike certain writers like the Jeff the Killer author. You got to treat those folks with, in my opinion, some degree of respect. The release time between sections for these two stories is anywhere from about a year to a year and a half. If you look at Sagan Hawks' YouTube video about the stories, he says that ABD came out in late 2012, abandoned by Disney. Although I did find one account claiming 2013. Unfortunately, a lot of these wikis don't have initial publication dates for the stories, so in some chances, your only way to know a publication date is to be able to ask the author, and I don't know him like that, lil bro, so it's not going to happen. Maybe eventually, but not right now. This story came out in 2014, so there's about a 1 year plus-ish gap between Abandoned by Disney and its sequel. And I think you're going to be able to see that over this time, Slimebeast does a lot of work strengthening his writing. A lot has been going on since my last post. I've received a lot of questions and concerns from folks who read my first-hand account of Mowgli's Palace, a resort that was built and abandoned by Disney. I want to thank everyone who mirrored the post. It's been taken down from a few places, mostly corporate sites, that were easily leaned on by a larger power. However, for every nuked topic or disappearing blog post, it seems like 100 more have popped up. So again, we have this idea of verisimilitude. Does this seem like something that is actually happening, or is this based on something that actually happened? Yeah. After Abandoned by Disney came out, it was circulated on message boards and all over the place. So you're calling reference to the actual internet activities that happened after the first story was released. This was very common in the day and kind of gave birth to the whole unfiction idea or the ARG, anything of that nature. They all kind of owe to this same tradition that was popping up in around the late 2000s, early 2010s era of the internet. This is something they'll have to face. There's no turning back for them. None for me either. I'm definitely being followed. For the first month or two, I chalked it up to paranoia. Any casual glance or half smile in my direction set me off. Hairs standing on the back of the neck and everything. The first one, or rather the first one that I was actually able to spot, was a telephone worker milling around my apartment complex. He was middle-aged, doughy, dressed just as you'd expect, but something about him just seemed off. I couldn't place it, but I knew this wasn't just my imagination acting up. He was awkward and out of place, not someone who was comfortable doing his routine job. I followed him around the corner only to lose him there. When I turned back to go home, there he was, staring directly at me, about 10 feet behind me, expressionless and cold. Exploring? He asked. That was all he said, and there was an accusing tone to his voice. Tell me, what blue-collar phone jockey does that? I guess that's the worst part. Never feeling safe, never feeling alone. That and the occasional Disney merchandise left somewhere for me to find. Little rubber Mickeys in the mailbox, a Disney Adventures magazine on my bookshelf. I consider this to already be a really drastic improvement from the first story. You wouldn't know this yet, unless you've read the whole story, but what he's doing here is foreshadowing the end of the story directly. So by foreshadowing the resolution, he's showing that he's grown as a writer. Remember, the photonegative Mickey scare at the end of Abandoned by Disney wasn't really foreshadowed at all. All that was foreshadowed was the haunting of the Mowgli's Palace Resort. So he's grown a lot between this 1 year span. They hide little Mickeys everywhere. 3 circles, one big, 2 small, in the silhouette of the famous mouse's head. I've started keeping a running list of Mickeys I've found. Coffee cup rings up on my table. What am I saying? Coffee cup rings on my table. One big, 2 small. Colored glass bottles left on the doorstep, viewed from the top down. All red. Graffiti on the wall on my way to work. A huge earth, small sun, and moon in the proper locations. They're everywhere. People have emailed me about this as well. If you repost anything I have to say, you're going to start finding those son of a bitches outlines. That's hard as one to say. People have emailed me about this as well. If you repost anything I have to say, you're going to start finding these son of a bitch outlines. I guarantee it. The best one by far, one that actually made me laugh because of the horror of it all, was a drawing in chalk next to my car. I was taken aback at first, walking through the parking garage, keeping an eye out for people following me. The outline seemed like a perfect match for, well, a murder victim you're probably familiar with if you've read my past posts. Written in yellow paint, I'm sure, was a single word: retract. As someone who has been bullied to get him to retract the story before, this is all honestly fairly accurate. Just escalated somewhat for horror story purposes. When I broke the story that one of Stephen Bunnell, Destiny, the streamer's producers, received money from Diddy to start an Omegle-like website, TinyChat, his producers spoofed a local phone number and started texting my wife to stir up shit between us. Luckily, unlike a lot of the deranged people that you meet online, my wife and I actually have a really good relationship. So she encouraged me to leave the story up. But it resulted in me getting doxxed, several attempts on my job were made. It was a fucking mess. And the idea that someone would be gang stalked over a story that they've published, yeah, as someone that it's happened to, guess what? It's very believable. The only thing that didn't happen to me was breaking and entering, and that was probably only because I wasn't fucking with a major corporation, just some random guy. So, again, as far as verisimilitude, I think we're in business. The only good thing that has come out of all of this is that I know that I'm not the only one who's seen something they shouldn't have. I'm not going to give their names because, well, if I have to tell you why, you haven't been paying attention. Researcher goes to Disney parks whenever he can, all throughout the year. He's not going to have fun, enjoy the rides, etc. He's looking for the Gascots. There's been a long tradition, apparently, of people reporting strange patrons throughout the park. Silent, motionless, staring patrons of every age, shape, and size. Men and women, adults, children, and teens. All wearing Disney-themed gas masks. Way back when, Disney would get tons of complaints about oddly dressed folks following others around the park. Folks who would then merge into crowds and disappear. Later on, gas masks caused folks to draw other conclusions, and reports of possible terrorists and bombers started following. All of those reports most likely went straight into the trash can. I know I can't find any sign of any such occasions reported on by the media, although you should be aware of the fact that Disney can pretty much control its press like no other. Researcher goes to the parks, talks to a few people, and tries not to draw any attention to himself. He'll just ask 3 or 4 families if they've seen his friend who's wearing a funny mask. He has yet to see a gas cost for himself, though on one occasion a child pointed him toward Frontier Town. As he raced through the crowd, he heard a single voice ahead cry out, "Mommy, I want a goofy air mask too!" Alright, this is probably a bit of a post hoc justification for the use of the word mascots in the first story, but because he does this, I think it largely undermines a lot of the complaints of the people that were talking about the use of the word mascots in the first chunk of the story. If you take these stories as a whole, even though they weren't really intended to be taken as a whole originally, but if you take these stories as a whole, he uses the word mascot in story 1 so that he can take a play on that and introduce the gas masks in story 2. I think if people had more patience and didn't try to read into the intent of the author with regard to mistakes, they might they might see these stories as more worthwhile, or at the very least, they would be able to pick up on the mistakes that actually caused the writing to not be at a professional level, rather than nitpicking. I think you can really kind of look at this as being the rise of CinemaSins critics. It's not real criticism to point out what you believe to be an inconsistency in the story, especially if that may not even be a real inconsistency. I think it really speaks to the way that people watch and receive stories now, and it's not changed for the better. A fellow I'll call Lifeguard worked in a Disney water park from 2011 through 2003. He stood at the top of a huge water slide and made sure none of the kids got too rowdy. He passed the kids through one at a time, telling them over and over again to be safe, keep their arms in, and so on. One day, as he tells it, this fat kid goes down the tube and doesn't come out the other end. He sent 2 or 3 kids after. The whole thing moves at a steady clip, so naturally you'd expect that if Fatty got stuck, the kids that followed him were stuck too. Not so. Only the big kid disappears. Everyone else comes out the other end, cheering and splashing like nothing's wrong. Lifeguard shuts down the slide, much to the aggravation of the kids waiting. Before you can go through any of Disney's strict procedures, splash. Fatty finally comes out. Staff members pulled the kid out of the water. He sank like a stone when he hit, his skin already blue and his eyes wide. All he would say was, "No face, kids," and "Stop squeezing." I really wonder if the audience is intended to interpret the boy in the slide as having gone to the bomb shelter that we're going to see later in the story. I don't think that the no-face kids really applies to the kids that are wearing the gas masks. They have a face, they're just cartoon character faces. But the no squeezing line makes me think that it could have been the author's intent, that these characters are being transported temporarily to Room Zero. I do think that we're supposed to see all of these vignettes as being related to Room Zero, but this one and another one that happens later, I believe it's called Club 22, I don't have my notes right in front of me, they don't do as much to establish that those 2 vignettes are about Room Zero as some of the later ones that we're going to talk about. One very explicitly about Room Zero, but the Gascot one that comes immediately before this, well, that's clearly hinted to be about Room Zero, but we're not really given much to explicitly link the vignettes about the slide and about Club 22 as being directly connected to Room Zero. So I think that is something that could be strengthened about this story for sure. Another reason that I'm not necessarily sure that this part of the story is even supposed to relate to the bomb shelter is that when he's talking about the no-face kids, well, the story suggestions that takes place at Mowgli's Palace, this takes place at Disney World Orlando, also talks about no-face kids. So even though we have a different setting, we have the no-face kids at both locations. So that implies to me that maybe that's not supposed to be about the bomb shelter. But as a work of art, the story would definitely be strengthened if every single part of it was pointing towards the bomb shelter story at the end. So instead of just not foreshadowing the ending, which now I think we have foreshadowing of the ending, think of it like a game of chess. In chess, you want to have all of the pieces pointed towards the opposing king so that they can attack at any time. And the supporting details of the story really should be working the same way. All of these supporting details should be pointing toward the same thing. And in my mind, that is Room Zero, the bomb shelter. Even in stories that are ambiguous, so if we go back to Shirley Jackson's The Summer People, even for stories that are ambiguous, you do still have all of the details trying to point towards the ending. They're just pointing towards more than one potential ending. So that technique doesn't really change, even if you try to introduce ambiguity. I do think all of the vignettes need to be pointed. The kid was okay, in case you're wondering. He got carted right off to the medical center. When the lifeguard was told to open the slide back up, he made a big stink about how it clearly wasn't safe. Despite his complaints, he was threatened with firing and begrudgingly opened the slide again. From that point on, he kept a closer eye on the kids. Every so often, they'd come out in the wrong order. Never as stunned as the fat kid, but always with a vague look of concern, a dreamy half-stupor that seemed as if they were trying to figure out what was reality. They'd take on some water and choke a bit, and they'd never come back up to the ride again. I read his emails with the same sort of unease you might be feeling right now. I wanted him to share his own story, but in the end, he didn't want to expose himself that way. I can't say I blame him. Snow White, which wasn't the actual role she played, was a character in the park. She had a nice little tidbit for me. You know what happens when a costumed employee drops dead in his suit? Like 1 second he's taking a picture with little Jimmy, and the next he's had a fatal stroke. A second costume mascot in the area has to sit with the corpse on a curb or bench and wait for a designated dry cleaner to arrive and cart the body away in a discreet manner. All the while, patrons have no idea they're sitting with a dead body for photo ops. Again, this part probably should have been cut or readjusted. It doesn't really work towards the other themes of this part of the story. But I think we could just kind of incorporate Corruptus into this story if you wanted to find a very easy way to strengthen it. What you could do is insert Corruptus here so that you don't have that bit at the end, and really work in the idea of the discrepancy between what people expect to have happen at a trip to a Disney park and the horrors that can sometimes unfold on a trip to a Disney park being the source of some of these hauntings. I think we're supposed to think that, but at the same time, it's not heavily emphasized enough to really point the reader towards that as a theme. Feel free to check your photo albums at this point. That was bad, but another fellow janitor went completely off the creepy charts. Disney World and probably others are built with a series of underground tunnels just below your feet. 3 stories worth. Anything and everything you can imagine is down there for use of the employees. They're called utilidors, utility corridors. Basically, that's the reason you don't see characters out of place or janitors wandering through the park. They pop in and out of hidden doors and travel a concealed town you're walking on. Janitor told me something that might be common knowledge, but was nonetheless news to me. Walt Disney had several apartments built into his parks. There's one above Cinderella's castle, there's one in the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, they're all over the place. More than that, there are nightclubs, a movie theater, a bowling alley, and much more. All behind doors built right into the whimsical facades you pass without a second look. Club 22 is one such hidden area. If you have the cash to join the exclusive club, you don't, then you'll have access to it and much more. Club 22 is a place where anything goes. Disney Co. call these places dark zones, spots where the squeaky clean visage of Mickey Mouse gives way to drinking, drugs, and yes, sex. Conversely, the rest of the park is the bright zone, with a few gray zone utilidors between. As Janitor has said, it wasn't always that way. It was more of a slow decline and the gradual relaxation of social norms within that elite group. The reason he knows all of this? You may have already guessed. He's cleaned it. After a lengthy background check and a non-disclosure form, Janitor moved up from a park attendant to one of the dark zone cleaning crew. Now, before you get some satanic human sacrifice vision in your head, Janitor saw nothing of the sort. Lots of empty bottles? Yes. Used condoms scattered like deflated New Year's balloons? Oh yeah. He cleaned up his share of blood, piss, and vomit. but it was all down to the unrestricted behavior of patrons as opposed to any sort of cult behavior. I do like the used condoms scattered like New Year's balloons imagery here. I think that it really emphasizes the kind of disappointed party that Slimebeast is trying to paint Disney parks as. At least that's how he sees it in retrospect. All that trash, that profane shit, went into a furnace and mingled with the smoke of a quaint cottage's chimney. If you've been to Disney World, you've breathed ultra condensed sin. There's a theme in this story that the phenomena in the park are being caused by this kind of corruption of the idea of what you want to have happen at a Disney park versus what actually tends to happen in a Disney park, that the experiences are disappointing. I think the New Year's balloon condom imagery kind of really emphasizes that, but there's not a lot to really link the hauntings with this kind of corrupted innocence of the Disney parks. And because of that, I kind of feel like a lot of these stories need a more direct connection to Room Zero. Or I guess the other alternative would be to spend more time really working on the idea that the corruption of innocence that these children are experiencing when they have these negative experiences at Disney is what's causing the hauntings. But without any kind of real substance there, the Club 22 story doesn't link quite as closely to Room Zero as I would like to see as a reader. Backing up this information was Hammer. Hammer mailed me the old-fashioned way, though I don't know how he got my home address. He sent me photocopies of work papers proving his employment, with the instruction to burn them when I was convinced, which I did gladly. Hammer worked around the Disney park, doing demolition and construction. At one point, he approached a superior regarding some strange construction plans. There was a wide rectangular area marked off on the blueprints, about the size of a supermarket. The area was left unnamed and only bore the words, "Do not dig." Not only was his superior in the dark, but he was super fucking purposefully in the dark. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to know about it, and ended the conversation with this space intentionally left blank. Hammer didn't get it. The area seemed a waste of space, and it was directly conflicting with the work his team had been given. He started poking around the area on his off time, finding only a derelict steel door and a great span of concrete just beyond. It was a supermarket's worth of blank gray floor. One of the lessons that I think that Slimebeast learns really well from Abandoned by Disney is that the climax of the story does need to be surrounded by some amount of set dressing, whether that's setting or whether that's characters, but there's got to be some amount of development that goes on before the big climax of the story. And unfortunately, I think with Abandoned by Disney, the only character that really gets developed is Mowgli's palace. The narrator doesn't change much, and we're not really introduced to any other characters. I think that lesson is totally learned by Room Zero, and we do get the introduction of the characters aside from the narrator. A lot of the elements that exist in a strong story exist in Room Zero. And it shows how much that Slimebeast had grown as a writer in that 1 year-ish time span between the two stories. One thing I want to add before I go back to the story too is that the climax of Abandoned by Disney, with the exception of the Mickey Mouse mascot that talks in the Mickey Mouse voice, and I think it's the voice that really seals the deal, it is a strong climax. And that is present, just as present in this story as it is in Abandoned by Disney. So you've got to keep in mind that Slimebeast was working off of a strong baseline. He just was missing a lot of the skeleton of a story that makes it feel like a fully fleshed out story in Abandoned by Disney. But those elements are more present here. Soon after, Hammer started picking gascots out of the crowds. Unlike all other reports, the people, the things, would stand in full view of the guy. They'd cluster together in the distance, or they'd just be pressed against a wall when he turned a corner. He said they moved weird, like they were weak or injured, like a deer that's been run down by a hunter and can't flee anymore. This description works so well in my opinion because a similar description of a trapped animal is used for the photo negative Mickey. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of the photo negative Mickey conceptually, but at least tying it into the story somewhat with the other people trapped in costumes, it helps strengthen that element of Abandoned by Disney, even though, in my opinion, it's one of the weaker elements. So Even there, he's showing, okay, maybe this was a weak part. What can I do here to strengthen it? And it's to kind of tie it together in a motif. Again, when things are connected, it is appealing to the reader. So, something to keep in mind for sure. The gas masks the Disney character faces with filters jammed in. He noted that they seemed wet on the inside, like condensation on a car window. Tiny beads of water glimmered behind the glass, making it impossible for any of them to actually see. Probing further, Hammer started asking questions of anyone and everyone who had been working in the park for a decade or more. He hit dead ends throughout until he was directed to Ida, an elderly woman who worked in a restaurant on Main Street. She'd been there since way back, and though nobody had the balls to ask directly, everyone knew she had plenty of terrible stories to tell. Hammer asked about the empty space, then about the gas-masked customers, and at first he thought he would receive the same non-answers he'd gotten so far. She was quiet, eerily quiet. "Room 0, she croaked, a single shaking hand placed to her cheek as if she were a little girl fearing a father's punishment. She didn't meet the man's gaze for the entire conversation. Room 0, as it turned out, was yet another hidden room, just like the apartments in Club 22. However, its sheer size and its spot deep beneath the park set it apart from any of the fun dark zones. It was a bomb shelter. Room 0 was built to withstand a massive attack, be it conducted by foreign or domestic enemies. Room 0 was to be stocked with enough rations to feed the entire park's average number of patrons at any given moment, and house a smaller yet lavish panic room of sorts for Disney higher-ups. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that Disney as a villain is a good opportunity to explore class differences, and I did say that unfortunately it's not explored very much. By very much, I mean this is the spot where it's explored. It's explored in about one sentence within the second story. I think it could have been a much bigger plot line or plot element within the stories. You have these people that are both very wealthy and cooperating with the American government. You have all the elements of a secret society here, and yet that element is not really explored. And I think between the elements of abuse, class differentials, and secret societies, there's quite a lot of potential for horror fiction that uses Disney as a villain. I just don't think that potential is fully meted out within these stories. During World War II, official Disney gas masks were actually produced for children to wear in the event of an attack. The idea was that it would be less scary for kids if Mickey's face was emblazoned on the wartime safety device. Yes, I know the obvious problems with that. During the Cold War scare of the 60s, when Disney World was constructed, Room 0 was stocked with similar masks as well. Whether they cared about the fears of children or just callous branding, the things found their way down there. What's more, some genius decided that kids would then be frightened by the gas masks their parents wore, and so all masks, adult and child, were made to comply to this insane standard. Ida described it as treating a wound with lemon juice. I'm going to make an assumption here as someone who's been on the internet for quite some time and guess that conceptually the Gascots started around the same time that these very old Disney costumes were circulating that were like really horrifying to a modern audience, but nobody in the pictures seemed bothered by them at all. And I feel like the same thing would be happening with these gas masks. They look scary to us because of our more modern sensibilities and because of what we associate gas masks with, which is warfare and even more specifically terrorism for a modern audience. This is even mentioned at the beginning of the story. And yet, those conceptions would not exist for a child in the 60s. So I'm not sure that the kids would actually be scared of the gas masks. If I were going to try to offer suggestions for this section, I actually think that the horror within the Gascots stems from the fact that these people found safety in the gas masks and probably didn't find them that horrifying, both because it was more normal during the time period and because they were something that they thought were going to save their lives. So, two big reasons. I think the thing that you can do is really show that these masks look horrifying to a modern audience, but to the Gascots, they're perfectly normal. And we kind of get a little bit of that at the beginning of the story but it's not really used as a major element. We talk about the modern conceptions of a gas mask and what it means, that a terrorist attack is imminent, but we don't really try to explain the difference between how these kids from the Cold War era would have perceived the gas masks and how the modern audience perceives the gas masks. I think a lot of these elements of weakness within a creepypasta can really be attributed to length. You don't need to make a short story long, but if you're trying to tell this wholly fleshed out narrative, which both of these stories are, then I do think you really need to be more in the 5,000 word length, or the story's going to feel like it's lacking something. Now, if you're just trying to do a more art piece where you're like playing with perspectives or you're playing with like satire or parody, I think short stories can be a lot shorter. Even within horror, I'm thinking of Maxwell's Silver Hammer, a short story by Stephen King. I in controversial opinion, I don't think Stephen King is that much less hacky than a lot of creepypasta authors. So I do think King is perfectly within the achievable wheelhouse of a lot of these writers. Slimebeast, for instance, could be putting out Stephen King quality work with just a little bit more polish. None of this explained what Hammer had been seeing, though. Not only the seemingly supernatural appearances, but the emptied out room as well. I've been in there, he explained. There's nothing but a cement floor and 4 walls. No, Ida shook her head and covered her mouth, stifling a sob. You've been on top of it. Someone or something sounded the alarm one day, when the park was at full capacity. The warning was clear. It was supposedly an air attack. Security ushered everyone down into the tremendous shelter. There they were ordered to put their masks and hunker down for the duration of the assault. Everything was quiet for about 30 minutes, save for the crying children and the frightened whispers. No one wanted to die, so they were thankful in a way for this strange measure of safety. So again, the point kind of emphasized, but not truly emphasized from the narrator's perspective, that these masks are scary to him, but maybe not to the people from the 60s. Then the first scream rang out. Hey, a man shouted, quit pinching. Waves of shrieks and yelps rippled through the crowd from one wall to the other, back and forth. Who's running around? Settle down, someone hollered. Who's laughing? This isn't funny. Ow, who stepped on my foot? The series of cries that Ida describes are why I believe that the boy in the slide could have been transported to the bomb shelter. The stop squeezing certainly sounds like something that could have been said by the people that were in room 0. But if this is Slimebeast's intention as an author, I don't feel that it's super clear, or I do think that it should be made a little bit clearer, especially since, as I said, the no-face kids are a consistent line that are showing up regardless of location. So there is some amount of world building going on here, and world building can be good or bad. It's not even a necessary element in storytelling per se, unlike setting or characterization. But I don't feel like the little seeds of world building that we get really pay off. And so I think it would be better just to have them as a single cohesive story pointing towards this bomb shelter, because I do think the bomb shelter is a really good payoff. Despite security guards urging to calm down and keep their cool, the crowd became more and more agitated until finally, after nearly an hour of madness, the lights flickered, then died. What followed could only be described as utter chaos. In the dark, only the wails of the young and the anguished cries of adults could be heard in a massive swelling din that bloodied the ears of all within that black echo chamber. A group of staff members and a select few patrons made it out of the door, ready to face the war above rather than the insanity below. What they found, of course, was a desolate yet untouched theme park. The music continued to play, echoing through silent storybook towns. This is another great scene that you feel like was really in Slimebeast's head as he was starting the story. It works towards the payoff. It's really eerie and brilliantly designed stuff. Upon returning to room 0, the few who stood at the top of the steel staircase that led down into pitch blackness heard no sign of the previous fray. There was only silence. Ida herself descended that staircase despite the begging of those she left above. She reached the reinforced doors, herself now awash in darkness and hearing only the buzzing in her ears. A single voice came out of the darkness. The echo made it impossible to tell whether the mocking, raspy voice was at the back of the bomb shelter or if it was right in front of her face. Shut the door, dear. You're letting out the cold. And I think this is the third moment that really shows that this was the scene that inspired the whole story. Really well mapped out. I tend to believe the scene was slightly inspired by the Russian sleep experiment, which was certainly in circulation by the time, where the subjects begin to want to stay in the room after they've been tested on. In fact, I would even describe this section of Room Zero as the Russian sleep experiment if it was not written like dog shit. So that's certainly high praise coming from me. Gripped by terror, she did just that. Within days, the entire thing, shelter, staircase, all of it, was covered within feet upon feet of cement. Air systems and generators above its ceiling were removed, creating the large, empty space. They're all still down there, Ida told Hammer. Down there with whoever that was. You might notice I've used Ida's name. Unfortunately, she passed away after telling her story. Accidental fall, supposedly, after getting out of bed to turn on a light. Such a company devotee, the paper reported, that her entire bedroom was covered with Mickey silhouettes. I think Room Zero ends on a much more effective, creepy note than Abandoned by Disney. Abandoned by Disney tries to be really poignant, which I think is something that captured kind of this young adult audience at the time, but I don't think it really ages as well as just using the dramatic irony of us as the audience knowing that the Mickey silhouettes are not from her being devoted to the company, but as a result, as a message of the gang stalkers that Disney as a corporation is hiring. The ending of the last story is pretty cool. It has what you call a parallel construction at the end where it says they didn't want anyone like me getting in and they didn't want anything like that getting out. So they sound similar, but they use slightly different words, though there are some in common between each phrase. It's called a parallel construction. It's a cool literary technique. But in my opinion, for the kind of fiction writing that's going on here, it is somewhat overly serious. You definitely have to keep in mind that if you're writing creepypastas, you're kind of writing the amateur fiction equivalent of R.L. Stine's Fear Street novels, which were horror novels for kids that had outgrown Goosebumps but were not quite old enough for adult horror novels. Creepypastas kind of tried to fill that same niche, and the overly seriousness of a parallel construction is probably not fitting for a creepypasta. You really do have to keep in mind as a writer who your intended audience is. And that was Room Zero by Slimebeast, aka Christopher Howard Wolf. Uh, One of the reasons that I really wanted to do this as a double feature is that you don't often get the opportunity to see how much an amateur writer can grow over the span of a year. And these two stories that are about the same subject matter really give you the opportunity to look at that. Now, I don't think you can talk about the entirety of Abandoned by Disney as a series without talking about how Slimebeast was treated on the internet by the people he wasn't recording podcasts with. Slimebeast's work was repeatedly taken from him without his permission and read in its entirety without any type of work being done by several big creepypasta narration channels. I'm thinking of Mr. Creepypasta specifically. And I do want to emphasize the difference between what I'm doing and what those people were doing is that they were not offering any sort of commentary on the work. I'm trying to use his work as a teaching moment to try to give people an opportunity to learn from what other amateur writers have done in the past. They just kind of presented his work in its entirety without any attempt to cut him in on the action, which, without permission, I think is a really bad look. He was correct. Slimebeast eventually got in a row with Mr. Creepypasta that ended up in him issuing a takedown order for Mr. Creepypasta's reading of Abandoned by Disney. I have somewhat complicated feelings about this, but in many ways, Slimebeast was just trying to vociferously protect his copyright in much the same way as someone like Harlan Ellison, who I've already mentioned, he kind of reminds me of. Do I think that his choice to do this ultimately affected his career prospects in the long term? Yeah, and would I suggest it to a lot of amateur writers? Probably not. The industry tends to remember Harlan Ellison negatively because he stuck up for his rights as a writer. And if you're trying to get work, the last thing that you want to remind someone in the industry of is someone who sued them for stealing their work. And that is exactly what happened with Ellison. The problem with the early days of the creepypasta community, in my mind, is that it came with an overly inflated sense of self importance. If you were part of the group of writers that had a fandom of people drawing art of your work, you definitely seem to think that you could make a living off of being a creepypasta writer. I think a lot of these people could have made a living as a writer. Slimebeast is no exception to that. But I think he put the cart before the horse, and I think it kind of hurt his long term career prospects as a writer. And all of that negativity aside, Slimebeast is probably one of the people that I would consider to be one of the better intentioned early creepypasta writers because he only really wanted a career doing something that he loved. For other writers, like the writer of Jeff the Killer, Susser, they saw young adult amateur fiction as the same kind of hunting ground as a pop punk musician, which is to say, they saw it as a place to do grooming of teenagers. And I'm going to have a lot more on that in an upcoming video where I talk about how pervasive this has been in the young adult fiction community, especially the amateur community. Ultimately, I don't know where Slimebeast comes down on things nowadays, but I feel like his anger towards Mr. Creepypasta was a little misplaced. Because while early narrators were absolutely taking advantage of authors for their free labor, they were not the parties that were going to be most guilty of that behavior. In my opinion, the biggest sharks that you have to look out for are the sharks that are tied to the big art industry of Hollywood. In 2016, a TV show came out on Sci-Fi called Channel Zero. Channel Zero adapted a different creepypasta or no-sleep story every season. During the production of the show, the son of notorious director and child killer Max Landis, contacted Slimebeast to talk about using Abandoned by Disney as one of the shows for their adaptations. However, they wanted to completely cut Slimebeast out of the creative process, which was likely a non-starter. Ultimately, the Harlan Ellison-esque approach that Slimebeast took to online fandom kept him from being ripped off by other more established artists at a time where it mattered more than his stance against Mr. Creepypasta. For this reason, I don't think he should ever be truly excoriated for wanting to protect his work from a genuine non-transformative infringement because it's just directly connected to standing up for yourself as an artist generally. But that is all that I have time for today. Between all of the two stories and the background information on Slimebeast as an author, I think you have plenty to watch. If you'd like me to dive further into Slimebeast's work, let me know in the comments. I really would like to talk to him before doing anything further, though I don't want to do too much from one artist without talking to them first. So if you are interested in that, let me know, but I'm definitely going to DM him first. If he is cool with it, I would love to shine a light on Funny Mouth because I don't think anybody really talks about it, and it's one of my favorite stories of his. If you made it this far in the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I was really happy with how the debut video did on YouTube, and I'm going to be trying to move as much of my audience over here as possible in the upcoming months. Join us in the next video where I talk about one of the other problems that amateur horror has experienced online, grooming. I feel like I don't want to end on grooming. That's like, see ya.
Now, the very young and the impressionable should definitely not be watching this program tonight.
What you have seen, there will be the most dire consequences for you and your family.